Hi, so we are going to give you a quick lesson about the Summer Exploration Project. So, to start out, a lot of this is going to focus around ecology. So, the study of scientific interactions among organisms and between organisms and their physical environment. So, really, everything is going to be connected through ecology as we move through the topics in this summer exploration. So, our first section is energy producers and consumers. Some of these words may sound familiar to you from other years of science. So, beginning, we're going to talk about autotrophs for a moment. Those are our primary producers. They need to capture energy from non living sources. So, they are going to generally get their energy from the sun and through photosynthesis are going to make energy. They're called autotrophs, auto meaning self, troph meaning feeder. So, we have autotroph meaning a self feeder. They store energy and then they are available for other organisms to eat them. So, our consumers, so our heterotrophs, are organisms that rely on other organisms for energy and nutrients. So, for example, animals, fungi, and many bacteria cannot harness energy from the environment as primary producers do. And so, these are our heterotrophs. Our carnivores, our herbivores, and our omnivores. So our carnivores are generally going to eat meat. Our herbivores are going to generally eat plants, and our omnivores could potentially eat both. One thing that I do want to note is that sometimes they don't necessarily stay in these individual little categories. So sometimes in nature, they so an animal that's described as a carnivore, such as a lion, might scavenge if they get the chance or if there's a need to. So they aren't always staying in their special little categories. So, more consumers. We may not always think of these other organisms as consumers, but they are. So, our scavengers, our detritivores, and our decomposers. So, those are going to help clean up the environment. They're going to make sure that those organisms that pass away, so for example, scavengers are going to consume the carcasses of other animals that have been killed by predators or have died of other causes, and our detritivores, that's where our earthworms fall into. Our decomposers, such as bacteria and fungi, are going to break down organic matter. So this is what helps kind of keep the environment clean or in a cycle, if you will. These are the category that helps break down things that are no longer alive. Next section is energy flow in ecosystems. So we have both food chains and food webs. And a food chain is a more simplified version, and that's a series where energy is transferred from one organism to another, whereas a food web analyzes the network of feeding interactions because we know that multiple different organisms may eat, for example, the grass. If we look at the bottom of this food web, we see that there's more than one organism getting energy from the grass in this example. So food webs do, this is a more complicated food web, and it does highlight the different types of organisms. And we can really see the interactions and the flow of energy as we start with, for example, plants, leaves, seeds, and fruits, and how that travels to our consumers, and then our secondary consumers, and then our carnivores or our, decomposers or scavengers like our vulture. So the track of the path of energy. We see our primary producers. So here's our energy pyramid. So each step in a food chain or a food web is called a trophic level. Primary producers make up the first trophic level. So various consumers occupy other levels. So there's our primary producers there. And then we have our first level consumers, our second level consumers, and our third level consumers. What you might notice is that the section gets smaller as we went up the pyramid. So, one way to illustrate the trophic levels in an ecosystem is with a model called an ecological pyramid. Ecological pyramids are models that show the relative amount of energy or matter contained within each trophic level in a given food chain or food web. This diagram is a pyramid of energy. Only a small portion of the energy that enters any trophic level is available to organisms at the next level. That's why that goes down as the pyramid goes up, because organisms expend a great deal of their energy on life processes such as respiration, movement, growth, and reproduction. Then we have a pyramid of biomass. So, in a pyramid of biomass, it's the total amount of living tissue within a given trophic level is what's called biomass. So, it's usually measured in grams of organic matter per unit of area. A biomass pyramid, or what we're looking at, is a model that illustrates the relative amount of living organic matter available at each trophic level in an ecosystem. So, our next topic is how populations grow. So, first, we need to examine what is a population. And a population is a group of organisms of a single species that live in a given area. In this example, we can see the penguins in a given area, and that is a population. I do want to note that there are many levels of organization, starting all the way with the microscopic, such as molecules like water, DNA, moving up to cells and then groups of cells. So we have organization below the level of a single organism. Then, when single organisms come together, that's a population, a group of organisms of one type that live in the same area. That's those penguins we looked at on the last slide. A community is populations that live together in a defined area. So you'll notice now we are not simply looking at the bison, we're looking at all of the organisms that live together in that one individual community. Then an ecosystem is the community as well as its non living surroundings. So, in this example, the hawk, the snake, the bison, the prairie dog, the grass, the stream, the rocks, the air, all are part of that ecosystem. And then, of course, the biosphere being the part of the earth that contains all ecosystems. So, as we go, it's important to know the difference between an organism, a population, and a community. Very important. So, the geographic range of a population, we'll look at how far spread that particular organism is. For example, a living organism like a bacteria in a rotting pumpkin, like you see in the picture to the right, is going to have a very small geographic range. It's maybe 1 cubic meter. Whereas if we compared to the population of cod in the Western Atlantic, that covers great stretches, as you can see, a wide range of the Northern Hemisphere, very different than the amount of bacteria that'll be in a rotting pumpkin. Density and distribution. So we have different organisms here, and we're going to match them up with the way they're distributed, because population density, while might be able to understand how many organisms are in a certain area, we might not understand the way in which they're spaced out. So here we have now matched. We have our penguins who space out more uniformly. We have our trees in this example, and they kind of grow in clusters. And then, if you've ever seen a school of fish swimming, they will be grouped tightly together, but they'll spread out from one another. So that talks about the distribution of organisms, and that's how individuals in a population are spaced out across the range of population. So it might be randomly, might be uniformly, or mostly concentrated in clumps. So growth rate. A population's growth rate determines whether the size of the population stays the same, increases, or decreases over time. If a population stays more or less the same over time, it has a growth rate of 0. That's not to say that the population is 0, just to say that it's not growing or shrinking. The growth rate is unchanged. We might have a high growth rate, means the population is increasing rapidly, or we could have a negative growth rate, which means that they are actually decreasing in size. So, our population growth, the factors that affect population size are birth rate, death rate, and the rate at which individuals enter, immigrate to, or leave, emigrate from the population. So, in this particular example, we can look at births and immigration as ways that the population will increase in size. So, this is a population of fish just as a sample. And then we have emigration and deaths as a way in which individuals leave the population and our population will decrease. Oftentimes, a balanced population will have about the same births or immigrations as deaths and emigrations, and then our population size would be staying about the same. In exponential growth, that's one of the types of growth. If you provide a population with all of the food and space it needs and protects it from predators and disease and removes its waste products, the population will grow. It can grow because members of the population will be able to produce offspring. And then those offspring will produce their own offspring, and then those offspring will produce more. So you can see it's almost a popcorn effect of, as they start to reproduce, it can grow exponentially over time. Bacteria is an example that, is a population that can rapidly increase, and we can see that here. We're going to look a little more at the curve on the next slide. So here's our exponential growth. It's a J curve, it's called. So if we look on the x-axis, we have time in hours, and we see it was a steady rise, and then all of a sudden the population went into exponential growth. So if nothing interferes with growth of this kind, the population will become larger and larger, faster and faster, until it's an infinitely large size. But we're going to look at some of the things that limit that from happening. So the population in that segment is rapidly increasing. So here's a more realistic curve, and that's the S curve. And this kind of shows us that a population's growth slows and then stops following a period of exponential growth. So here, if we look at this, we have, exponential growth cannot explain population growth fully because there's more to it. So something has to happen to keep a population from growing exponentially forever. I'm sure you can think of some of those things, some of our limiting factors: food, water, shelter. Let's look. Phase 1, that's our exponential growth phase. So that's here, and that's where the growth is rapidly increasing. Phase 2, the growth slows down. So in real world populations, exponential growth does not continue for long. At some point, the rate of population growth does begin to slow down. It does not mean that the population size is decreasing. It simply means that the rate of increase is going slower. And then phase 3, the growth stops. At some point, the rate of population growth drops or may drop to zero when we reach something called carrying capacity. So it may fluctuate slightly, but generally the population will stay about the same. This is very realistic, and in the sense that many times populations stay at about the same size. So that carrying capacity is very important because that's when a population can stabilize. And that means that the maximum number of individuals of a particular species that a particular environment can support. So for example, to stay at carrying capacity means a population will have adequate food, adequate water, adequate shelter, and there's not an overabundance of predators in the area, and they can stay at that carrying capacity. So limits to growth. Now we just talked about different ways a population can grow. There are ways that it can be very much so limited as well. So some limiting factors can either be density dependent or density independent. So density dependent are the ones I mentioned: food, water, and that would be if there's a shortage of food, competition for mates, diseases, predation. In density independent factors, so a flood, a fire, pesticides, a lot of these could be human interactions, because it doesn't matter the size of the population. If a fire comes through, the population density doesn't matter. The fire will destroy what's in its path. So competition being one of the density dependent limiting factors is more individuals will use up resources sooner. Just because there's more individuals living there means that they're using up food, they're using up water, space, sunlight, shelter, and they are going to compete for those resources. So when populations become crowded, individuals are going to compete for food, water, space, and other resources. And some individuals obtain enough to survive and reproduce, while others might not. Others might obtain enough resources to live, but not necessarily enough resources to raise offspring. And that's when we might see a decrease in reproduction or a decrease in the amount of organisms that survive. So, still others may starve to death or die from lack of shelter. Competition for changing resources bases that are limited can lower birth rates, increase death rates, or both. Parasitism and disease, this is an example, and they can spread quickly through dense host populations. So, for example, we see in this little picture ticks on a dog's ear, and they are feeding on their host blood. They can carry diseases, and that's an example of parasitism. And it's definitely a density dependent because the more dense the host population is, the more easily parasites can spread from one host to the next host. Predator and prey do have relationships that fluctuate over time. So, this example is a moose and wolf population, and you can see the moose is red on the line graph, whereas the wolves are blue on this line graph, and the population fluctuates very clearly. So, the moose population can grow large enough that the moose become easy prey for the wolves, and then when the wolves have plenty to eat, their population can grow, and then wolves begin to kill more moose because there are more wolves, so they need more food. And then that'll take our moose population down. So if you track it over time, you'll see a very clear link in as one rises, the other may fall, and the cycle will repeat itself over time. Next, we have habitats, niches, and species interaction. So, a habitat is an area with a particular combination of physical and biological environmental factors that affect which organism can live within it. So, think of it as an organism's address within a biome. It's its own particular little house, its own particular little habitat. And everything in the habitat needs to meet its needs, needs of the organism. So we have microhabitats and microbiomes because some organisms are quite small. So a microhabitat is a tiny part of a much larger habitat, and it might have its own set of environmental conditions called its microclimate. A microbiome is a microbial community. So, for example, here we might see the tree's leaves, the bark on the tree. We might see the bacteria underground. We might see the rotting log, the forest floor. These are all examples of microhabitats and microbiomes because this particular fungi will never leave that location unless its spores reproduce. And it may only, when its spores reproduce, it may only travel a few feet. It's not going to travel in a wide environment. So now that we've talked about organisms, we've talked about habitats, we're going to talk a little bit about what can live in which type of environment. And that's the tolerance of the organism. Organisms only have like a range in which they tolerate external conditions, in which they can survive and reproduce. So if we were to look at this, we see the population growth is the biggest in the middle. That's the optimal range because organisms don't want to experience times of stress. So what we have is a zone of stress and then the lower limit of the tolerance. If you go too far in either direction, the organisms do not survive. So at the center, once again, is the optimum range. Organisms are likely to be most abundant in that optimum range and then become more rare in zones where there's physiological stress and then absent from zones of intolerance. An example could be of an external factor, something like temperature. If it rises above or falls below a species' optimum range, the individuals of that species experience stress and there might not be any survivors. So a niche is a species' individual little role. You can imagine if the habitat was its address, you can imagine the niche as kind of that species' job. And so a species niche includes the range of physical, abiotic, and biological biotic conditions, so living and non living conditions in which it can survive and reproduce, as well as the ways it obtains the resources it needs. So, a competition, if they're in competition with each other, you'll look at any community. For in this particular photo, we're looking at two plants and they're in competition. So, when organisms attempt to use the same limited ecological resources in the same place at the same time, they're going to be competing for things. So, these, for example, these two plants could be very well competing for sunlight, water. Um, in which cases resources need to be divided. I'm going to go back to the same picture you saw when I talked about niche, because in this example, we have three different types of birds, and they live and use three different ranges of height of the same tree. So we have a competitive exclusion principle, which means that we rarely find species in natural communities with overlapping niches because each of these three different species of bird really wants its own range to live and find food. So they can all eat off the same tree, but not be necessarily overlapping into each other's food source. And last, we have symbiosis. So, as we look at all these different organisms living together, living off the resources in their environment and their habitat, we are going to also look at how they may interact with each other. So, commensalism is a relationship in which one organism benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. Mutualism, which is a relationship with both species, both benefit. Parasitism, like those ticks we saw in the dog's ear a few slides back, is a relationship in which one organism is harmed and the other one benefits from the relationship. In the picture here, we see clownfish and sea anemones, and they help each other to survive. So, sea anemones use stinging tentacles to protect themselves from predators and to capture prey, where certain fishes manage to still snack on the anemone's tentacles. And then some species of anemones, however, live in close association with clownfish, and in this picture, which are immune to anemone stings. When a clownfish is threatened by a fish eating predator, it seeks shelter by snuggling deep into the tentacles that would kill or paralyze most other fish. But the clownfish helps the anemone because if an anemone eating species tries to attack the clownfish's home, the clownfish will dart out and fiercely chase away fishes that might even be many times their size. So, in this example, they both benefit from this relationship. So that concludes the summer lesson that you will need in order to move on to the second parts of this assignment. Hope you enjoyed.